We're constantly being told that buying vintage is sustainable, but is it actually? Vintage fashion is used all the time in the costume industry as a way of making productions feel authentic. And it's also a more sustainable option and also a cheaper way for production companies to get clothing. To contrast this, most modern day productions use fast fashion clothing, and this is often associated with a throwaway culture, which means that garments get worn once and then thrown away or disposed of and potentially put in landfill. Statistically, fashion is the second largest polluter in the whole world, which is a crazy fact. And the costume industry is a very large part of that. There are massive amount of quantities of clothing being produced and then thrown away, discarded or sent to landfill. So vintage clothing may be a more sustainable option, or is it hiding unsustainable issues behind closed doors? So firstly, vintage fashion and costume can be sustainable as it helps to extend the life of pre-existing garments. So there's no new production, there's also use of higher quality fabric, and there's an encouragement of more sustainable shopping. There's also a huge media influence for the use of secondhand and vintage clothing. A really good example of this would be the eBay and Love Island collaboration. My own primary research conducted on my own social media platform told me that 65% of people would buy vintage clothing if they saw it used successfully on a production, which is really good, and it's like a really nice way of helping show people how good vintage fashion can look, especially on a production set or set in a specific era. And the eBay and Love Island collaboration saw a 1,600% increase in searches for vintage clothing and secondhand fashion on eBay, which is a really good statistic and helps more people realise that that people don't need brand new clothing. A really successful example of this would be the work done by Glass Onion Vintage, and I've used this as my case study for this subject. They've been a really successful company and they've worked on some massive productions and supplied lots of vintage clothing. Some quite notable ones would be The Crown and Tinseltown and the film Giant, which was brought out last year. They have 4 permanent stores in the UK, and I visited 2 of their stores, the one in Leeds and the one in Sheffield. It was a really nice way to conduct my own primary research with no bias, just my opinions, and I found that really helpful. I loved the inviting nature of the stores, and I think it was really enticing, and there was lots of nice displays in the windows, and it really encouraged people to go inside. I also found that for vintage clothing, the prices were really reasonable. I think the prices will range from about £5 to about £30, which I think is really good for a good quality piece of vintage clothing, because you know it's going to last, in comparison to such as Shein, where you can get clothes for really cheap but then they get damaged or they break or you have to throw them out. So I think it's a really good option for people to get shopping secondhand. So they also have warehouses where costume buyers can go in and choose lots of different clothing to fit the specific characters for their production. So I think that's really good. Glass Onion Vintage has also made a lot of reels on Instagram, and it's really good to spread the word that these productions are using vintage and sustainable clothing. And you can see all of those on Glass Onion Vintage's Instagram. So this is definitely a really positive step towards making the costume industry that bit more sustainable. A large-scale company can implement circular fashion into its brand. And it's also a really good example of how people can rescue clothes from landfill and put them to a really good use. However, the reality of vintage clothing in the costume industry isn't as good as it seems, unfortunately. The first major issue is the transportation of the vintage clothing, because a lot of them are sourced from quite far away countries, especially if things are shot in the UK. They're sourced from like Asia and the USA, and it's quite a lot of air and land and sea miles to get here. And obviously those methods of transport use a lot of carbon dioxide that gets burnt and then gets released into the atmosphere and contributes to global warming and melting of ice caps, which is really harmful to the environment. There's also the issue of cleaning the clothes, because obviously these clothes are second-hand and production companies will want to make sure that they are cleaning the clothes before their actors wear them. And this is a real issue, because especially if these clothes are made out of synthetic fibres, these release microfibres when they're washed. And this can be a real problem because they are released into the atmosphere, be released into the ocean and cause real harm to sea life. Synthetic fabrics also take 20 to 200 years to decompose, which is a shocking statistic, because even clothes from, like, if you think about now, we're in 2026, clothing from like the 1980s might have not been decomposed yet. It's just like a crazy fact, and we should really just keep these clothes alive and keep using them. And also fast fashion brands such as Shein like to replicate the like popular vintage clothing that's like popular on like social media at the moment, and it's a real issue because people will find it cheaper to buy from fast fashion brands, but then these fast fashion brands will use synthetics, will make things poorly, and then the throwaway culture will just happen again and the circular fashion will just be ruined. I find it really interesting that Glass Onion Vintage describes their clothing as brand new second-hand on their website. It can be slightly misleading. It frames second-hand as being brand new when it's not actually. This is called greenwashing, and it kind of shows how you can't always trust what a brand says. Even Glass Onion Vintage, quite a high status and like successful brand in the vintage fashion industry. So while vintage clothing can clearly reduce on waste, there's many issues to do with transport, the cleaning, repairs raises massive sustainability questions that must be factored in when considering the sustainability of vintage clothing and costume. So to conclude, is the use of vintage clothing in costume actually sustainable? Not completely, no. I think nothing can ever be 100% sustainable, but there's definitely areas where it can improve. It creates severe environmental costs such as the transport, the repairs, the cleaning, which have a massive impact on the environment. But despite it not being a perfect solution, it's definitely a step in the right direction, and it's definitely something that more production companies should consider. It definitely can be used in a responsible way if it's used by a brand that you trust. To end my project, here is a brief reflection of my findings for the sustainability of vintage clothing within the costume industry. What I found most interesting throughout this project is how complex sustainability actually is within the costume industry. On the whole, costume is fairly unsustainable, so I was surprised to discover some positives. At first, I assumed that vintage clothing would be a straightforward solution because it directly avoids producing something new and makes use of garments that already exist. But as I looked further, it became very clear that the negatives outweighed the positives. There are hidden factors such as transportation, cleaning and repairs, which all contribute to the overall environmental impact. And they are not always obvious, as shown by the 93% poll result, where most people thought on my social media that the use of vintage fashion in costume was sustainable. Even when visiting stores such as Glass Onion Vintage, it made this even more apparent to me. On the surface, everything feels so sustainable, with a strong focus on reuse and second-hand shopping, but behind that there are still questions about sourcing and how environmentally friendly the whole process is. It also made me think about the role of the consumer. Costume really influences how people dress and what they choose to buy, so while vintage fashion can encourage people to be more sustainable, it can also lead to increased consumption through the use of fast fashion replicas. Overall, this project has really shown me that sustainability isn't just about choosing one option over another. It's about fully understanding the full life cycle of clothing and the wider impact of those choices.